Prince George told 3 drunks who were bothering Guardsman Elliot Marsh at Buckingham Palace, "You're not brave. Brave people don't pick on someone who can't fight back." For minutes, dozens of tourists and even security guards stood by while the harassment got worse in front of the world's most famous gates. What Elliot Marsh did next broke years of quiet and transformed his career forever. The fight lasted about 15 seconds. The effects lasted forever. But to understand why this event was important, you need to know what kind of officer guards Buckingham Palace and how to get the red suit. If you like stories like these, it would help me out a lot if you subscribed and liked the video. Elliot Marsh walked and talked like someone who had seen more than most guys his age. As kids pointed at his huge bearskin headgear, and adults murmured about whether he was real or merely a fancy adornment, his countenance exhibited no emotion. But behind those steady eyes were 3 years of fighting in Afghanistan's Helmand province, where being alive meant being able to read every face in a crowd and tell the difference between real dangers and people who were just looking. The military had trained Marsh to be what his sergeant called a human tripwire. He could see everyone who came near him out of the corner of his eye. Marsh listed them all without moving his head even 1 degree. His instructors in Helmand had drilled this into him during those hot desert patrols where making the wrong assumption about an approaching stranger could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Combat had taught Marsh that danger rarely announced itself with fanfare. The most dangerous times started with something normal: a man strolling too slowly toward a checkpoint, a woman whose eyes moved in a way that was different from those of her friends, a car that went past the same intersection too many times. These little things made the trained soldier different from the ceremonial figure. Marsh had learned to trust the uncomfortable feeling that crawled up his spine when something didn't fit the pattern. The changing of the guard ceremony was like a strange theater of complete stillness that had survived wars, revolutions, and hundreds of years of social change. People came from all over to see this old ceremony, and they expected the guards to stand still like museum pieces while they snapped pictures and recordings. They didn't know that soldiers lived under the red fabric and polished brass and had sworn an oath to protect, no matter where the threat came from, foreign battlefields or troublemakers at home. As the morning crowd grew thicker around him, Marsh's trained awareness began to pick up on small signs that something was changing in the air. 3 males near the front barrier moved in a way that was different from the families and tour groups around them. Their voices were rougher and louder than the prevailing murmur of respectful observation. One of them had on a dirty England football jersey that appeared like it had been slept in. Another man had a bottle wrapped in a brown paper bag with the possessive grasp of someone who had been drinking since breakfast. The third man continued looking at Marsh with the calculating look of someone who was about to do something bad. Their body language showed that they felt entitled and had a lot of liquid bravery, which Marsh had learned to identify from his time in the military. In Afghanistan, being alive meant being able to spot possible threats. At Buckingham Palace, the stakes felt different, but they were still high. These guys acted like they dominated the space around them, getting closer to the barrier with each passing minute. Real Queen's Guards weren't just people in costumes for tourists to see. They were active duty troops from elite regiments who had been trained in combat tactics and were allowed to use force when required. Marsh's rifle was real, and his bayonet was a real weapon. The same discipline that kept soldiers steady under enemy fire also kept people still while they were being harassed. Every guard knew that staying calm under duress was a sign of professionalism and a tactical advantage. But as Marsh saw the 3 men's behavior became increasingly hostile, his military instincts started to send him warning signs that he couldn't ignore. The way they pushed the limits by getting closer to the barrier. The way they looked at him with disgust instead of interest. It looked like they were getting ready to do something more than just watch. He had learned from experience that when many signs pointed to the same thing, action generally happened rapidly. The gathering around him kept becoming bigger, but Marsh kept his eyes on what was happening. He had been trained for battle zones and ceremonial obligations, but what was about to happen would put his ability to reconcile military etiquette with basic human dignity to the test. The 3 men were getting closer, and with each step they took toward him, their plans became obvious. What began out as teasing words quickly turned into something far worse. The guy in the soiled England football jersey walked with the over-the-top swagger of someone who had been drinking since morning. He pushed past families and old couples without saying sorry, and his mediocre tattoos were easy to see. His friend held a bottle of cider wrapped in brown paper, and the third man held his phone as if he were expecting something worth filming. Their aggressive sense of entitlement set them apart from the polite tourists around them right away. They claimed space at the front barrier with the swagger of men who thought the world owed them entertainment. The harassment started with crude insults that showed they had no respect for what they were seeing. The man in the football jersey yelled across the courtyard, asking Marsh if he could blink or if he lived by photosynthesis like a plant. His friends chuckled at everything he said, egging him on with their drunken laughter. The crowd around them became uncomfortable as these men treated a trained soldier like a circus performer, but they didn't say anything. A little girl in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked in a clear voice that cut through the uncomfortable silence, "Mommy, why are they being mean to the soldier?" Her innocent question brought attention to the adult's cruelty, but her mother just pulled her closer without answering. The child's point of view broke through the adult tendency to make excuses for inappropriate behavior or think that someone else will deal with the problem. What happened next went from verbal abuse to physical violence. The man in the football jersey took a smashed beer can out of his pocket and tossed it right at Marsh. The metal container hit his clean red pants and then fell to the ground, making a noise on the old cobblestones. People gasped as they tried to figure out what they had just seen, and instead of moving in to help, everyone pulled out their phones right away. The cameras weren't focused on the ceremony. They were intent on recording proof of what was happening in front of them. The situation got worse and worse, until the man in the football jersey reached under his jacket and brought out a plastic bottle that looked like it had yellow liquid in it. He held it up for everyone to see and yelled, "Bet this will make him move." A lot of tourists quickly backed away in fear, realizing that things had gone from uncomfortable to really dangerous. Parents took their kids and walked toward the palace gates, no longer interested in getting the ideal picture. The way the audience reacted showed everything about how people act when they see brutality. Some others spoke in low, frightened whispers, while others held their phones higher to get better video. Some people began to move away from the growing fight, but no one spoke out to warn the three men to stop bothering them. As everyone waited for someone else to do something, the silence grew heavier. Security staff stayed in their places and followed established procedures, but their training didn't cover what to do when tourists decided to bother the guards they were supposed to be protecting. The difference between policy and basic human decency formed a hole that the three guys filled with more and more anger. The bystander effect happened in real time as witnesses chose to document the event instead of stepping in. Each person thought that someone with more authority would take care of it. The mood had changed from ceremonial respect to something like a medieval spectacle, where people gathered to watch someone suffer for their own amusement. The uncomfortable truth was that good people were choosing to watch instead of do something about evident cruelty. No one came forward, and the air was thick with tension about what might happen next. That tense moment showed how the crowd thought, as hundreds of witnesses chose to capture what happened instead of stepping in. Everyone gazed at each other, waiting for someone with more might or bravery to go first. The businessman in his ironed suit looked over at the retired soldier who was standing close. The veteran turned to look at the palace guards. It looked like the security guards were following rules that were meant for different types of threats, because everyone thought someone else would do something. There was a vacuum where no one took responsibility for stopping the obvious cruelty happening in front of them. Even the security guards stayed away, following rules that didn't seem to fit the situation. They learned how to deal with terrorist threats, control crowds at official events, and handle big groups of tourists during busy times. But it looks like the manual didn't say what to do when things got worse than what was written down. People who were expected to keep order and safety were confused by the difference between policy and basic human decency. The bystander effect happened in real time as culpability spread among hundreds of witnesses. Fear, etiquette, or the belief that someone else would step in kept hundreds of people from moving. What transpired next revealed that the crowd's lack of action really gave the three men more courage to act even worse. The audience didn't respond to their first verbal taunts, which they took as approval or at least acquiescence. They thought they could stretch the limits without meeting real opposition because there were no bad consequences for hurling the beer can. The crowd's silence gave them permission to step up their harassment, which led to a dangerous cycle of rising aggression. The courtyard was quiet, except for the mechanical sounds of camera shutters and nervous whispers. People kept taking pictures of the harassment instead of stopping it. In the digital age, bystanders started to act differently. Instead of stopping harm, they focused on documenting proof. People had learned to think like content providers first and good citizens second because of social media. The chance of getting viral film seemed more important than the need to aid someone in trouble right away. Parents pulled their kids closer, but didn't say anything to defend the soldier who was being humiliated in front of those same kids. The tour guides kept giving their planned explanations in low voices, acting like the harassment was just an unfortunate interruption that didn't need to be dealt with. Police personnel that were on patrol in the neighborhood stayed on their allotted routes, either not knowing how bad things were getting or not sure when they should become involved. The system that was supposed to keep everyone safe seemed to be stuck by its own rules. Guardsman Marsh stayed completely still, even though he was getting more and more embarrassed, because his duty and protocol kept him from responding to verbal provocation. His training had made it apparent what he was supposed to do at ceremonies. He wasn't meant to get involved unless he was touched. He wasn't allowed to say anything. He wasn't meant to admit to being harassed or reply to insults. This strict discipline helped him in combat zones, but now it worked against him because the crowd saw his stillness as acceptance of the abuse instead of professional restraint. The man with the plastic bottle was about to go from verbal abuse to physical assault, and the situation reached a breaking point. Still, no adult stepped up to halt what everyone could see was going to happen. The lack of guts from everyone made a perfect storm where cruelty could thrive in broad daylight with hundreds of witnesses. The uncomfortable truth was that good people were choosing to watch instead of take part in basic human decency. Into that void of timidity walked the one person no one expected. Prince George, who is 11 years old and wearing a crisply ironed navy jacket, has been watching the whole thing happen with more and more worry. He kept his posture straight, not stiff, just there, as his father had told him to do during these test runs to teach him about royal duties. This was education in action, letting George deal with the complexities of public life without his parents always being there to help him. It also encouraged him to form his own opinions about what he saw happening. The protection officer next to George stayed professional and quiet, following the rules that said he should only speak when directly addressed. This systematic way of teaching George stressed the importance of autonomous observation and processing, which are important skills for a future king to learn about duty and responsibility. The officer's role helped George understand the traditions he would inherit and let him come to his own judgments about what was happening. Instead of focusing on the ritual, George was more interested in Guardsman Elliot Marsh. His sharp eye noticed that Marsh's military-grade stillness was different from just ceremonial display. This ability to see and value the discipline and dedication of those in service showed a quality that would be very important as the events of the morning continued to get worse than anyone could have imagined. The harassment that kept getting worse made George feel bad as he watched adults do nothing, while a dedicated soldier suffered in silence. His face hardened with what could only be defined as wrath when the three men's behavior changed from making fun of him to threatening him. The protection officer stayed focused on the rules, even though they didn't take into consideration that this kind of moral crisis was happening in full daylight. George knew that Marsh was in a bad situation and needed someone to break the loop of passive observation that had let the abuse go on without anybody stopping it. He clenched his jaw. He understood what he had to do. The instant George made his choice was a turning point that would test all of our ideas about age, authority, and moral courage. He went forward with a calm determination that belied his young age, moving beyond the mental blocks that had stopped hundreds of people around him from progressing. As he moved toward the rope barrier, the crowd's attention shifted as people began to realize that someone was finally doing something, even though they couldn't have guessed who that person would be. George walked behind the rope barrier and up to the three men with a calmness that shocked the crowd into silence. His actions were planned and intentional, and he didn't display any of the hesitancy or doubt that might be expected from someone his age dealing with angry adults. As the throng took in what they were seeing, you could hear them all taking a deep breath. An 11-year-old prince was doing what hundreds of mature men had failed to do, walking right into a dangerous situation to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. Everyone who was there that morning will remember the strong remarks that followed. George's voice rang out clearly across the courtyard as he said, "You're not brave. Brave people don't pick on someone who can't fight back." The way he said it clearly and steadily made the men think about what they were doing, and showed the difference between real courage and cowardly bullying. His comments rang out in the morning air with the authority of someone who knew what real bravery was, even though he was young. His intervention showed insight and courage that most of the adults in the audience had not shown throughout the whole developing fight. His frank challenge took the attention away from Guardsman Marsh's weakness and put it on the three men's clear lack of character. George's ability to see the main problem and deal with it head-on showed a level of moral clarity that went beyond his age and social status. He knew that someone's dignity was being attacked and that following the rules was less important than being a decent person. The 11-year-old prince had become the moral compass that the situation needed so badly. His determination to act on principle, even when it meant putting himself in danger, showed that he had leadership skills that went beyond royal education or ceremonial training. George had gone from just watching to doing something about it, proving that understanding duty required doing something when others were too scared or indifferent to do anything. But the three men didn't want to hear moral teachings from a child, no matter who that boy was. As he thought about how humiliating it was for him in public, the man in the football jersey's face grew crimson with rage. He couldn't take it when an 11-year-old called him a coward in front of hundreds of people. His pride was too drunk to handle it. With his fists clenched, he approached the rope barrier in an aggressive and unexpected way, as he got ready to cross into the restricted area where Prince George was waiting. George didn't back down from the fight that was getting worse. He kept up his moral stand with remarks that hurt more than any adult could have. He said that the guard was trained to protect individuals like them, even people who didn't deserve it, and that cowards attack people who can't fight back when they think no one will stop them. Even though the threat was getting closer, his voice stayed firm, exhibiting a level of calm that most mature men would have trouble keeping in the same situation. The protection officer knew when words were about to turn into violence. As he hurried to put himself between Prince George and the threat that was coming, his training kicked in, but things were happening too quickly for regular procedures to work well. The man in the football jersey had already decided to cross the barrier, and his movements showed that he was acting like someone whose judgment was clouded by alcohol and hurt pride. Guardsman Marsh watched this from his ceremonial post, and his military instincts were screaming warnings that couldn't be ignored any longer. His training had made it obvious that he should stay at his position unless he was touched, but Prince George's safety was more important than any rule in the manual. Marsh jumped over the rope barrier in one smooth motion that showed years of physical training and combat experience. He did it with the speed and accuracy of someone whose life depended on moving quickly under pressure. What happened next showed Marsh's military training in ways that the ceremonial uniform couldn't. He quickly and calmly responded, using just the right amount of force to stop each threat without hurting them permanently. The first man was pushed back onto the old cobblestones. The second fell to his knees, as Marsh's strike hit with perfect accuracy. The third tried to get away, but he was caught and stopped before he could get away or regroup. Each movement was as smooth and efficient as someone who had learned how to end fights fast and decisively. The whole fight, from Marsh's initial rope crossing to the last man hitting stone, took exactly 15 seconds. His moves were smart and efficient, exhibiting the kind of tactical thinking that sets skilled soldiers apart from amateur combatants. During those 15 seconds, the cameras of people watching didn't see a brawl. They saw disciplined protection in action. Most people who saw what happened were confused by how quickly he acted. Marsh's actions safeguarded both Prince George and the ideas they both followed, even though he knew that he might lose his job as a result. He broke all the rules by leaving his position and using force against civilians. But protecting the royal family was more important than everything else. His military experience had taught him to put mission success ahead of respecting the rules when lives were at jeopardy. After the event, police and paramedics arrived to process the scene and care for the subdued males. The crowd was silent and shocked as they thought about what they had seen. Many of them still had phones that had recorded parts of the fight. The man in the football jersey looked up from the cobblestones with blood on his lip and recognition in his eyes when he saw Prince George standing safely behind the barrier. The old courtyard was quiet except for the professional voices of the authorities who were coming. The tourists kept quiet for the first time that morning as they saw officials take charge of a situation that had gotten way out of hand with usual royal rules. The courtyard of Buckingham Palace had become a crime scene as uniformed officers dealt with the three males who were lying on the old cobblestones, while police officers took testimonies from witnesses who had finally found their voices after staying quiet during the fight. Paramedics checked each guy for injuries. The man in the football jersey sat with his back against the palace wall, blood dripping from his split lip as he stared at the ground with the blank look of someone who was thinking about things he didn't expect. The scene played out with the organized efficiency that comes when professionals take charge of chaos. The people who had been talking and taking pictures throughout the harassment were now standing still, their phones down, and their voices were hardly audible as they witnessed justice being served with clinical precision. Parents clutched their kids closer as older people shook their heads at what they had seen. The mood had changed from fun and games to serious understanding of what had really happened in front of them. The man in the football shirt looked up from where he was leaning against the wall and spoke words that could be heard across the quiet courtyard. "I didn't know," he continued, his voice heavy with guilt and the realization that what he had done was very serious. His statement made it clear that his harassment was not done out of malice, but rather out of ignorance. However, ignorance could not excuse the cruelty he had shown. The look in his eyes showed that he finally understood the difference between bothering a tourist attraction and attacking a trained soldier who had served his country well. The incident couldn't be treated as normal, because too many people saw it and too many phones recorded parts of the fight. Dozens of videos from different viewpoints would quickly show up on social media, making sure that the tale would go well beyond the palace gates. The fact that so many people wrote about it meant that both Marsh's acts and the three men's actions would be looked at by the public. What had started as private harassment had turned into a public reckoning with consequences that none of the people involved had seen coming when the day began. Colonel Harassing got there within minutes of the police, and his dress uniform was spotless, even though he had to respond quickly to reports of one of his guards breaking the rules. He walked up to Guardsman Marsh like someone who had spent decades reconciling military discipline with real life. He asked his inquiries directly and without any room for negotiation. "You broke the rules. You left your post without permission. You used force against civilians." Each allegation hung in the air between them, as Marsh stood at attention, ready to take whatever punishment his actions had merited. Marsh's reaction to each charge was simple and uncompromising. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice firm, even though he knew those two words may terminate his career as a ceremonial guard. His willingness to take responsibility demonstrated the same strength of character that had made him act when others were too scared to. He had chosen duty over protocol, protection over professional progress, and he was ready to deal with the repercussions of that choice without complaint or justification. What happened next was completely different from what everyone thought would happen in the military and in his career. The colonel's face softened a little as he gave news that no one had expected. Instead of being punished, Marsh would be moved to personal protection detail at the family's request. The royal family asked for him, since they knew he was good at making decisions and staying calm under duress. He broke the rules, but instead of being punished, he was promoted. This shows that sometimes doing the right thing gets you recognition from the people who matter most. Prince George walked up to Guardsman Marsh as the official proceedings were coming to an end. His small frame carried itself with the dignity that comes with 11 years of royal training. The throng stood quietly and respectfully as the young prince glanced up at the soldier who had put his job on the line to protect him. The next remarks were brief, but they showed real gratitude. George responded, "Thank you," and his voice was clear and firm. Those two words recognized not only Marsh's physical protection, but also his willingness to stand up for what he believed in when others chose to just watch. The event changed everyone who saw it, giving them a new understanding of duty and bravery that went beyond royal protocol or military rules. For the first time that morning, tourists put down their phones and clapped for real, realizing that there were actual individuals behind the ceremonial robes. George and Marsh had both learned that sometimes you have to break the rules to protect what matters. This lesson would affect their future choices when they had to choose between protocol and principle. News of what happened would quickly spread through networks of witnesses and social media, creating ripples that would reach far beyond that one morning at the palace gates. The next day, the people at Buckingham Palace were different. They were calmer, more reverent, and seemingly more conscious of what they were really seeing. The air in the morning was just as crisp as it had been the day before, but everything else had changed in ways that couldn't be measured by news reports or policy changes. Tourists still stood around the ceremonial barriers, cameras still clicked, and kids still pointed at the huge bearskin hats. But the way they acted suggested that they had a new understanding. People were no longer talking casually, instead they were whispering respectfully. The aggressive jockeying for the finest camera perspectives had given way to patient observation. News of what had happened the day before had traveled through both digital and personal networks, affecting the mood surrounding the royal grounds. Thousands of individuals saw social media posts with bits of video footage overnight. But more crucially, people who had seen the fight in person were telling their friends, relatives, and co-workers about it. Parents told their kids what they had observed, and tour guides now include what happened yesterday in their stories about duty and service. Instead of just asking for directions, Hotel concierges started getting insightful questions about royal procedure and military duty. The change was clear in subtle gestures that showed broader changes in how people saw things. A little lad in a school uniform walked up to the ceremonial barrier and gave Guardsman Marsh a short salute as he passed by on his patrol route. The act barely lasted a few seconds, but it was a sign of real respect, not just something to entertain tourists. Marsh acknowledged it with a slight shift of his eyes, which was a small movement that showed professional respect between two people who knew that respect is earned through actions, not by position or protocol. Prince George watched the ceremony with a different expression that morning, and his face showed that he had learned something new about what leadership really means. His posture stayed upright and alert, but his eyes traveled differently around the picture, taking in subtleties that he hadn't seen before. When adults stayed still, he learned that sometimes being a leader requires doing something when others choose not to, speaking up when others stay quiet, and taking responsibility while others look for excuses. His training in royal duty had taken a practical turn that no classroom could have supplied. The crowd's conduct showed this new understanding as they clapped for the guards with real respect and asked more meaningful questions about military service and royal duty. The long applause showed that they understood the principles the guards stood for. They went past the surface-level pageantry to recognize the genuine people who were serving behind the ceremonial uniforms. Families pointed out things they had overlooked before and told their kids how important it is to have military bearing and how hard it is to stay calm under duress. The guards themselves seemed to stand straighter and march with a little more accuracy, and they did better because the crowd liked them more. Both George and Marsh had learned new things about bravery, duty, and standing up for others when authority doesn't act. Their shared experience had given them an understanding that went beyond age and social status. This showed that moral fortitude doesn't depend on rank or convention. George had learned that being a leader means taking risks and doing things on your own, whereas Marsh had learned that standing up for your beliefs sometimes means breaking the rules. They showed that duty and bravery are more important than age and uniform. Their actions made other people realize that there are genuine people serving their country through military and regal duty, not just in ceremonies. The guards were reminded that their ceremonial tasks were part of something more than just their jobs, and the royal family learned to appreciate the people who protect and serve. A brave 11-year-old prince and a dedicated guardsman brought honor back to an old tradition. This showed that modern actions can refresh timeless values. The event also showed that true leadership comes from taking responsibility for oneself, not from a position of power, and that protecting what matters requires personal commitment, no matter what the consequences might be. Their actions had a lasting effect that will impact how the public interacts with those who serve in the future. They set new criteria for when ideals are more important than processes. The day that altered everything started with simple words that broke through the apathy and cowardice of adults. Following rules without question isn't real strength. Understanding when to disregard them to preserve what's really important is. Prince George and Guardsman Marsh both knew that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules and taking the punishment. Their actions that morning at Buckingham Palace showed that courage isn't about age, rank, or position. Remember Prince George's challenge before you stay silent. You're not brave. Brave people don't pick on someone who can't fight back. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes teach us the most important lessons about courage and standing up for others when everyone else chooses to watch. If this story moved you, share it so more people can learn what real courage looks like.